Take a seat and make yourself comfortable. The onboard staff will be happy to provide you with any information and assistance. Our navigation will last about 50 minutes and will take you to see Milan from a particularly unusual angle. In fact, these waters have been the lifeblood of the city for millennia, and from here we can see its evolution. Our history starts a long time, precisely 2,500 years ago, when the Celtic peoples who lived in the Po Valley decided to found a city in this place. They called it Medilan, which means land in the middle of the waters, because Milan was almost an island surrounded by the waters of 5 rivers, Olona, Lambro, Savesco, and 2 streams, Nerone and Pudiga. The city did not remain long in the hands of the Celts. The Romans, in their expansion to the north, conquered Medilan, renamed it Mediolanum, and began to connect the rivers with canals for the irrigation of the fields. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder already testified to the presence of a complex system of irrigation canals all around Milan. During the Roman Empire, Milan became great, the center of trade in northern Italy, and after the fall of Rome, for over 100 years, it became the capital of the Western Roman Empire until the year 402. But the fall of the empire was a hard blow for the city, which had to face centuries of wars and raids by barbarians and invaders from all over Europe. No longer being able to count on flourishing trade, agriculture became necessary for survival, and with the passing of the centuries, the irrigation network became more and more extensive, while the canals themselves began to have their own identity and were called Navigli. Thus, with the advent of the Middle Ages, the outskirts of the city saw the birth of hundreds of agricultural communities, in most cases managed by monks. But if the waters of the Navigli seemed to flow the same every day, the structure of the city changed rapidly. Taking advantage of its strategic position in the center of northern Italy, Milan, after the Dark Ages of the early Middle Ages, became a powerful city, and its canals played a fundamental role in its commercial expansion. So at the beginning of the 13th century, the city decided to lengthen and make navigable the defensive moat of Milan to create a navigable canal to facilitate the transport of goods. The great protagonist of the evolution of the river system was a Bolognese civil servant, the podesta Benno de Gozzadini. A man of great culture and visionary for the time, he understood how trade and the transit of goods could give an economic and cultural boost to the city. For him, trade was the best way for wealth, knowledge, as well as economic and social development. So he devised a series of works to make the Naviglio Grande navigable for about 20 kilometers, up to the village of Abbiategrasso, and build the first Darsena, the port of Milan, then located not far from the current one in today's Piazza 24 Maggio, where the art of Porta Ticinese stands in its center. The works were inaugurated in 1272, but their cost soon became exorbitant, and the city found itself deeply in debt. To solve the problem, de Gozzanini, also an expert in tax administration, proposed a very innovative and radical solution for the time: taxing the lands of the church. The revolutionary choice, however, did not receive the favors of the aristocracy and the clergy, who jointly plotted against de Gozzanini and sent him to trial. Found guilty of stealing public money, he was sentenced to an exorbitant penalty. He had to repay all the construction costs out of his own pocket, around 4,000 lira at the time. Unable to pay, the poor podesta was stoned and his body thrown into the city waterways so dear to him. De Gossanini's work, despite the ingratitude of his contemporaries, has proved to be of the highest level, has withstood the judgment of time, and it is at the base of the canal in which we are currently sailing, the Naviglio Grande. The longest and oldest of the canals that today runs for about 50 kilometers with a vertical drop of 34 meters. At the widest point, it reaches 50 meters wide, while the narrowest point is our boarding point with its 12 meters of width. Its waters irrigate 50,000 hectares of countryside through 116 water inlets. The Milanese people immediately understood the importance of navigability of the Navigli, and in the second half of the 14th century, in the Visconti era, they began working on the expansion of another canal, the Naviglio Pavese, which we will also see during our navigation. Unfortunately, the works were not as fast as those for the Naviglio Grande. Although it is only 30 kilometers long, to overcome the difference in height of 50 meters, it was necessary to build 14 locks, and despite the intervention of the greatest engineers of the time, including Leonardo da Vinci, it took 4 centuries to complete the works. Its construction lasted during the Spanish domination, then the Austrian one, and later under Napoleon. It was finally inaugurated in 1819 upon the return of the Austrians. In retrospect, the 4,000 lira needed to build the Naviglio Grande, and which cost Gossanini his life, seemed a paltry price. The slowness of the works, however, did not discourage the initiative of the rulers of Milan, who wanted to expand their network of navigable canals. So in 1443, the Duke of Milan, Filippo Maria Visconti, began the works for the expansion of another canal, the Naviglio Martesana, located north of the city. This work, 39 kilometers long, connects Milan to the Adda River near the city of Trezzo d'Adda and overcomes a vertical drop of 19 meters. It was completed in only 50 years during the reign of Ludovico il Moro, the last Duke of Milan before the French invasion. Once the Naviglio Martesana was finished, the opportunity arose to connect the network of canals to Lake Como, which was less than 3 kilometers away from it. Historical sources report that the first project for what would become the Naviglio di Paderno was entrusted directly by the King of France, Francesco I, to his dear friend Leonardo da Vinci in 1516. The excavations started in 1520, but were immediately interrupted due to the war against Spain. The Spaniards defeated the French, became masters of Milan. The works were interrupted and then went on in fits and starts for the next 250 years. The inauguration of the Paderno Canal took place only in 1777. The route was composed of an impressive system of 10 navigation basins, which covered a difference in height of 27 meters. If you're wondering what a navigation basin is, it is a simple but ingenious way to overcome a difference in height. It is formed by a basin, called reservoir, and by 2 barriers that delimit it. By opening downstream and closing upstream, the reservoir empties and the boat descends to the lower level. By reversing the procedure, the reservoir fills up and the boat rises to the upper level. The construction and maintenance of such a complex system of canals was an incredible technological and human effort. We imagine engineers and workers busy at the construction sites, but once the works were completed, the real masters of these waters became the boatmen. Now we are heading to one of the places most dear to this particular category of workers, the Church of San Cristoforo sul Naviglio. San Cristoforo, Saint Christopher, is in fact the protector of sailors, and his legend is quite singular. Before changing his name to Christopher, the future saint was named Reprobus. He lived along a river where he was a ferryman. Reprobus, however, was a ferryman without a boat. It is said that he was a giant with extraordinary strength and forded the river carrying goods and people on his shoulders. One night a boy appeared to him who wanted to cross the river. A routine chore for Reprobus, who put the baby on his shoulder and began to cross the river. When he reached the middle of the ford, however, his load began to get heavier and heavier until Reprobus bent his knees and ended up under the water. So it was that the passenger had to save him, grabbing him by the hair and dragging Reprobus to the shore. To the amazed ferryman, the child would reveal that he was the Christ, also confessing to him that he had carried on his shoulders not only the weight of his little body, but the weight of the whole world. Reprobus understood that he had the Saviour in front of him. He converted and was baptized with the name of Christopher. The name Christopher in fact means bearer of Christ, and the Church of San Cristoforo protects all those who sail on these waters. The church you see on the right is the Church of San Cristoforo al Naviglio. It is one of the oldest in Milan, and it is very particular. It consists, in fact, of two churches side by side, built over 3 centuries using 3 different architectural styles. The oldest body dates back to the mid-13th century. It is in Romanesque style, and you can see it on the left side of the facade. Its construction is prior to the excavations of the Naviglio Grande. It stood on the side of a small river called Lambretto. Today this river no longer exists, replaced by the canal on which we are sailing. The second part is in the Lombard Gothic style, erected in 1399 by the will of Gian Galeazzo Visconti, as an ex voto to thank God for the sudden end to the plague that had struck Milan. Originally, the church also integrated a lazaretto, but the vote of Galeazzo Visconti must have been very effective, because it soon proved useless and was closed in 1405. The last intervention was in 1625, during the Spanish domination of Milan. An apse was added and the dividing wall demolished. Thus, San Cristoforo became a very rare church with 2 parallel naves. Until the 1950s, this area was still open countryside, and for those arriving in Milan by boat, the Church of San Cristoforo was the signal that they were just a few minutes away from docking. Today, the boatmen are no longer as numerous as they once were, but have been replaced by the newlyweds. The church is in fact the most requested places for weddings in Milan. There is certainly something mysterious about this place that favours love. Ludovico il Moro, the last lord of Milan, also wanted to meet his future wife, Beatrice d'Este, right in San Cristoforo sul Naviglio. From there it was love at first sight for the Duke of Milan. Ludovico and Beatrice met in very particular circumstances. In that January 1491, a polar cold had fallen on Milan, and the Naviglio Grande was completely frozen. In modern times, the Naviglio no longer freezes, but during the winter its waters are not exactly hot, with a temperature between 8 and 9 degrees. In this icy environment, every year we witness the tradition of the Cimento Inverna, the winter trial, a swimming competition in the waters of the Naviglio. It all began on January the 25th, 1895, when 7 members of the sports association Canottieri Olona challenged each other in a swimming competition over a distance of 150 meters in order to advertise their newly formed association. Incredibly, all the participants finished the race alive, and the event had a huge advertising echo, helping to spread the passion for swimming and rowing among the Milanese people. The tradition still goes on, and every last Sunday of January, the Cimento is organized. The event attracts thousands of spectators, and the brave swimmers have increased in number. From the original 7, there are always about 100, ready to jump in the water at the midday touch of the bells of the Church of San Cristoforo. As mentioned, the participants in the first trial were members of the Canottieri Olona, and it is precisely of this association that we now see the historic headquarters. Founded in 1894 by a group of rowing amateurs, it is not the first rowing company in the city. This record belongs to the Canottieri Milano, created in 1890, whose headquarters are located right after that of the Olona. The years between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th were incredible years for the birth of sports associations. The 2 Milan football teams were also founded in those years. The AC Milan was born in 1889, and few people know that the original name was Milan Football and Cricket Club, while FC Inter Milan was born a few years later in 1908, following a discussion within AC Milan. In AC Milan, there was the desire to limit the number of foreign players who could play in the team. So some associates decided to found a new team and call it Football Club Internazionale, a clear message that the new team wanted to be open to everyone, Italians and foreigners. Like the football teams, the rowing companies also continue their activity and have recently been joined by the Canottieri San Cristoforo, founded in 2009. During our navigation, you will see various types of rowing boats. They're all members of these associations that carry sports life on the Naviglio ahead. As you have surely noticed already, travelling a few kilometres along the Naviglio Grande, we find ourselves outside the historical Milan, and we encounter a more industrial context. This fact is due to the rapid growth of Milan in the 20th century, which radically transformed the city. This area was once open countryside, and the names of the streets still recall the farmhouses and cattle farms that stood there. The lands around Milan were, in fact, ideal for agriculture and livestock. Not only were they watered by its rivers and canals, but their subsoil is also characterized by numerous springs of natural water. Milan stands on a predominantly clayey ground, almost impenetrable by water, which, unable to flow, is trapped on a relatively low surface, where it stagnates and heats up. Having no way of penetrating downwards, the water then flows to the surface through the springs at a constant temperature between 9 to 10 degrees in winter and 12 to 15 degrees Celsius in the summer. This presence of relatively warm water allowed forage to grow even in winter, guaranteeing farmers ideal conditions for their livestock. Not surprisingly, legend has it that one of the most famous Italian cheeses, the mascarpone, was born nearby here. It is said that the fundamental ingredient for tiramisu comes from a farmhouse called Cascina Masciapa. Where exactly it was located is shrouded in mystery, but it was certainly a few kilometers south of Milan, near one of the Navigli. What we know for sure is that this cheese is mentioned for the first time in a text in 1168, and that both the Emperor Charles V in the 16th century and the adventurer Giacomo Casanova in the 18th had appreciated its taste. The hunger for cheese of the Milanese people was insatiable, and in addition to mascarpone, every type of cheese arrived in the city, transported by boat from the farmhouses outside the city. It often arrived fresh and was aged before being sold, and one of these aging places is located right nearby, the ancient village of the cheesemakers, Elburg de Famagiat, in the Milanese dialect. The village is characterized by the casere, typical Milanese popular buildings characterized by a courtyard with two entrances. Here the cheesemakers aged the cheese and, once ready, loaded the wheels onto the wagons for city distribution. Working all day in contact with the cheese impregnated the clothes of the cheesemakers with a very characteristic odor. It is said that every inhabitant of the village could be recognized by the smell it emanated. The dairy business ended in the 60s, and the smell of cheese has completely disappeared from the edge. Only the casere remain to remind us of this ancient tradition. Converted into apartments, they are very fashionable among those looking for the charm of old Milan. You can see them by going to Corso San Gottardo. Many of the courtyards are accessible to tourists and onlookers. After hearing about the trade on the Navigli for so long, surely you're wondering how the heavy barges full of goods moved between the canals. With all these bridges, certainly they could not sail, and in many places the canal is too narrow for the oars. The solution is very simple. When the barges were travelling upstream, they were towed. The boats were attached to draft animals, horses, donkeys, mules, or oxen, by means of large ropes called alziae. The origin of the term derives from the Latin helciarius, and it literally means that pulls the boat. Now the boats are pulled by engines, but this term has remained in the names of all the roads that line the canals, which are not called vie, but alzei. These have a very particular characteristic. You can notice it passing under the numerous bridges of our route. A part of the road passes under the bridge and runs along the Navigli, a necessary feature to avoid having to detach the animals every time one encountered a bridge along the way. The ability to attract resources from outside, integrate them, and transform them into assets for the city is a constant in the history of Milan. This feature is not limited to the stones that physically built Milan, but expands to the people who create the social fabric of Milan. The city has always been a destination for immigration, both from other parts of Italy and from abroad. Today, Milan is certainly the most cosmopolitan city in Italy, where 20% of the population is foreign, with 300 different ethnic groups, and 60% is from other Italian regions. Finding a person with both parents born in Milan is a challenge bordering on the impossible. In the past, this area was one of the main points of arrival for thousands of immigrants in search of fortune. The demand for low-skilled labor to unload goods made it an ideal destination for newcomers. Jobs were abundant, but at the same time they were poorly paid, so it was essential to offer many accommodations at an affordable price, and the buildings in the area were built to optimize the limited spaces. This is how the Casa de Ringhiera, balcony houses, the typical buildings of the Milanese working-class neighborhoods, were born. They consisted of a ground floor where the shops were located, while the living quarters were on the higher floors. To save space, there were no internal corridors, but each apartment was accessible via a common balcony overlooking the internal courtyard. This space, protected from external interference, became the beating heart of the community of people created by the residents in each building. Until the middle of the last century, life flowed between clothes hanging, gossip, and songs of the longshoremen. Today, the craft shops have almost all disappeared. In their place, there are bars, nightclubs, and art galleries. But don't be fooled by the facade. The charm of old Milan continues to live in the shelter of its courtyards. Many are freely accessible to visitors, and crossing the door, you will find yourself stepping back in time. In this working context of the Navigli area, daughter of a dispossessed count and a peasant woman, one of the greatest poetesses of contemporary Italian literature, was born on March 21, 1931, Alda Marini. She was one of the few stars of Italian poetry, a cursed poet with a tormented life in a very close relationship with madness. Her poems are almost an inner therapy of a person with bipolar disorder, a rare, lucid expression of a mind afflicted by psychic problems, therefore unique, fascinating, and ageless. When she was alive, her presence on the banks of the canals did not go unnoticed. Alda used to give manuscripts and poems to anyone, to write verses on any material she had available, and to dictate her works to those who wanted to write them. Her poetry was a living work. Unfortunately, her death in 2009 deprived us forever of this experience. But if you go to Via Magolfa 32, not far from our pier, you will find the Alda Marini House Museum. Here you can have a sample of her universe, the confused expanse of objects that filled the last years of her life. The space reconstructs the poet's room, which has been reassembled with the original furnishings of her apartment. There is the typewriter she used with carbon paper instead of tape. Then there are her dresses, hats, the red IKEA armchair, her necklaces, her beloved piano, her favorite doll on the bed, and a bouquet of dried roses given to her by Valentina Cortez. Dedicated to the poet, there is also a stone bridge. You will see it after the church of Santa Maria delle Grazie, which will soon appear on your left. The name Santa Maria delle Grazie will surely be familiar to you. You will all know the church that houses the most famous representation of the Last Supper, a masterpiece by Leonardo da Vinci. But you probably don't know that there is a second church in Milan dedicated to Santa Maria delle Grazie, right here on the canals. The first thing you notice is its bare red brick facade, which makes it look like a modern church, but is only the result of a miscalculation of the budget during its construction. The original plan included a neo-Gothic facade in marble and a complex cycle of statues. But when in 1909 the project came to be implemented, the funds were finished, and on the outside only the apse, the bell tower, and the stained glass windows with huge coloured glasses were completed. The facade was left incomplete, and it still appears in bare red bricks. After the church, always on the left, we see the alley of the launderers, Vicolo dei Lavandai. The alley is a very well-preserved architectural jewel dedicated to the strong guild of the laundry workers, active from the Middle Ages to the end of the 19th century. The launderers were the men who offered a home laundry service for wealthy families in Milan. After collecting the dirty clothes door to door, they carried them here using panniers, and they washed them kneeling on wooden crates filled with straw, called brelin, placed in a row under the shed. The clothes were rinsed in the stream and then rubbed on the stone stools that you can still see today. In modern times, this all-male activity slowly disappeared, and already at the beginning of the 20th century, the workers of the Brotherhood were replaced by women, who brought their own clothes here to wash. For this reason, the old Milanese call this street the Alley of the Washerwomen. The material used for washing, in the absence of modern detergents, was the most varied, from the palton, a paste made up of ash, soda, and soap, to mixtures based on cow manure and lye. The most common detergent, however, was simple boiling water mixed with ash, applied with a cloth called cenaracchiolo. At the furthest end of the alley, there is a small square in gravel, which was the place of unloading of the goods brought with the boats to the Darsena, when the Navigli still fulfilled their original function of trade route. Furthermore, in a courtyard adjacent to the alley, a centrifuge used to dry clothes at the beginning of the 20th century is still available. The alley also housed an old grocery store that sold soap, bleach, brushes, and other laundry tools. The premises of the shop, now closed, are currently occupied by a restaurant. The main structure is still in excellent condition.
The Scodellino Bridge is ahead of you. The Scodellino or Scodellina Bridge is the last bridge over the Naviglio Grande before arriving at the Darsena. There are two theories on the origin of its name. The most accredited says that the bridge is so called because, to cross it, the boatman had to pay a transit fee of a scudello, a coin worth a quarter of a scudo. The other version says that during the construction of the cathedral, the boatmen used to stop in a tavern near the bridge to consume a bowl of soup, in Italian scodella. In fact, all the stones for the cathedral reached Milan through these canals, and being a boatman required energy for hard work. One of the oldest idioms in Milan also dates back to the time of the construction of the Duomo. Boats carrying stones to the cathedral were not subject to any transit fees. To identify their cargo, the acronym AUF, Ad Usum Fabricae, for the construction of the cathedral, was engraved on each stone. So, even today, for the Milanese, doing something AUFO means doing something without paying. We now come to the Darsena. Darsena is an Arabic word that originally meant port. In Italian, the word has evolved over time and is now used to indicate a sheltered anchorage area, sometimes covered. In Milan, however, this word retains its ancient meaning, and the Darsena is the port of Milan. A rather mobile port which over the centuries has moved from the city center more and more to the outskirts, to the current position of Porta Ticinese. But even if it was far from the sea, the port of Milan resembled every port of the world with its bars, inns, taverns, and brothels. Here the sailors gathered to eat, drink, sleep, perhaps in the company of a complacent girl. Precisely because of this characteristic, Porta Ticinese was called by the Milanese Porta Chica, perhaps a distant memory of the Spanish domination of the 17th century. In fact, in Spanish, chica means girl. The area, however, has not been abandoned its tradition of entertaining people. The brothels have now closed, but Porta Ticinese still remains among the favorite neighborhoods for enjoying the nightlife of Milan, with its many bars, restaurants, and nightclubs. Pass through these canals, and every piece of marble that made the Duomo Cathedral came from here. But even in more recent times, the Navigli have played a fundamental role in the life of the Milanese. After the Second World War, the bombings had reduced the entire city to a pile of rubble, and along the course of the Navigli was transported the sand and gravel that rebuilt Milan. In the 1950s, Milan was the 13th commercial port in Italy by tonnage. A canal barge could carry 200 tons of supplies, as much as 5 lorries at a much lower price. In fact, it took only a single farm tractor to tow a caravan of 10 boats. But if ferrying itself was relatively cheap, the cost of maintaining the banks and the entire navigation system soon became unsustainable, and by the 1970s, river transport began to be abandoned, replaced by road transport. The last freight boat docked in the Darsena dates back to March 30th, 1979, and in the 1980s many barges were converted into bars and restaurants. Today there is no longer any trace of the old barges. The last ones were removed in 2019, and navigation on the canals is reserved for people and for recreational and sporting activities.
The second bridge of the Darsena, located at the start of the Naviglio, is the Ponte Trofeo, the Bridge of the Trophy. It takes its name from a large stone monument from the Spanish domination that stood in the area, commissioned by the then governor of the state of Milan, Don Pietro Enrique de Acevedo, Count of Fuentes, and commonly called the Trophy of Fuentes. The trophy was erected in 1601 to celebrate the conclusion of the works that made the Naviglio Pavese navigable, thus connecting Milan to the Adriatic Sea through the city of Pavia. Unfortunately, the celebration was way too early when it was erected. The construction of the canal was far from being completed. For this reason, the monument earned the nickname of Trophy of the Liars. The monument was demolished in 1872 and removed to make room for the current road network. Some of its pieces are still preserved in the Castello Sforzesco Museum. Following the Naviglio Pavese, we meet the first lock, called Conchetta, Small Basin. La Conchetta is the first of the 14 locks that you encounter while travelling along the canal from Milan towards Pavia. It overcomes a difference in height of 2.5 meters, while the total difference in height between the two cities is 50 meters. Despite its ancient appearance, thanks to a careful restoration work, the lock has a cutting-edge technological heart, and it is controlled by computerized systems, monitors, and remote controls. This type of lock is called Vinciana, in honor of its inventor, Leonardo da Vinci. This is his most important contribution to the Navigli system, and perhaps to humanity, as far as hydraulic engineering is concerned. In 1482, Leonardo arrived at the court of Lodovico il Moro, Lord of Milan, as an engineer, and in 1497 he was commissioned to fix the hydraulic structure of the Navigli. His stroke of genius was the creation of the locks, an invention that is now used all over the world, from Panama to the Suez Canal, from Niagara Falls to the canals of northern Europe, and of course in the Navigli. Instead of going up and down in a roller shutter, the Vinciani locks open like a gate with two doors that lock at 45 degrees, thus opposing a wedge to the force of the current. Like the bow of a ship, the wedge discharges the energy on the banks of the canal, creating a static balance system. Probably Leonardo was not the first to think of this type of lock. It was a technology already used by some medieval engineers. But Da Vinci certainly had the merit of creating detailed drawings of the locks from various points of view, both in elevation and in plan, with particular attention to the outlets that regulates the flow of water. These drawings have allowed the maintenance of these structures over the centuries and are still visible today in the Atlantic Code, kept at the Pinacoteca Ambrosiana in Milan.
The Navigli in the past, when Milan was a large industrial city, have strongly suffered the effects of the pollution. Today, however, both due to the changes in the Milanese economy and thanks to the cleaning work undertaken by the institutions, the waters of the Navigli are very clean. Our tour is now coming to an end. We hope you enjoyed your experience. If you are curious to discover other places of Leonardo da Vinci's Milanese experience and admire his masterpieces, come and visit us at the Milan Visitor Center by Zani Viaggi. Our tours will satisfy your every curiosity. Ask our staff or consult our brochures on how to reach us. Thank you for choosing Navigami. We wish you a pleasant stay.